Hey there, folks. I'm Carl, your friendly neighborhood storyteller, and I've been in the business of covering jaw-dropping tales for over 30 years. But let me tell you, nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the story I'm about to share. It's about a pair of twin sisters who walked into a courtroom expecting justice, but got ridicule instead. The twist? They didn't just stand there and take it. Oh no. They dropped a bombshell that left a racist judge stunned, and the entire room gasping for air. Picture this: Judge Harlow Jenkins, a man so smug he could probably charge for lessons in arrogance, is up on his high horse, tearing into these young women like it's his full-time job. He's making cracks about their background, their skin color, and even questioning if they understand respect. The crowd in the courtroom? Silent, stunned, and probably just as uncomfortable as you feel hearing this. And the twins? Oh, they're calm as a summer breeze. Then Riley, one of the sisters, steps forward, steady as a rock. And what she says next? Folks, I swear, I've never seen a room flip like that. She looks that judge straight in the eye and says, "Your Honor, with all due respect, you might want to rethink your tone. My sister and I, we've been trained by the United States Army. We've completed elite combat training, and we don't just understand respect, we've been trained to defend it." You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Jenkins? The man who always has a snide remark locked and loaded? Speechless. I'm telling you, the look on his face was priceless, but trust me folks, this wasn't some mic drop moment where everyone clapped and went home. No, this was just the tip of the iceberg. What happened after that? Well, hold on to your coffee mugs because we're about to rewind and see how it all started. It was a quiet summer morning in Riverton, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and just about every family's been here for generations. Riley and Ryan Carter had grown up here too, but their lives were a far cry from the picket fence fairy tales most folks around here were living. Raised by their mom Maria, the Carter twins were tough as nails. Maria worked herself to the bone at 2 jobs, one at the diner, the other cleaning offices downtown, just to keep the lights on. It wasn't easy, but the twins? They thrived. By the time they were teenagers, they were already turning heads. Straight A students, track stars, debate champs, you name it, they were good at it. But they knew Riverton didn't have much to offer them in the long run. So on their 18th birthday, they made a pact and enlisted in the army together. For 6 years, they trained and served their country, rising through the ranks and earning more medals and commendations than most people earn in a lifetime. But life doesn't pause when you're away. While they were overseas, Maria's health began to decline. By the time they returned home, their mom was in a fragile state, and the twins vowed to stick around to take care of her. They moved back to Riverton, thinking they could lay low, work, and focus on family. Little did they know, the town hadn't changed much. And by hadn't changed, I mean the same old prejudices were alive and kicking, just like they'd been when they were kids. Now, Riverton isn't the kind of place where racism wears a white hood. No, it's subtle. It's in the way the shopkeeper watches you a little too closely when you're browsing. It's in the fake smiles, the muttered comments, and of course, the local justice system. And the man who ran that system? Judge Harlow Jenkins. Jenkins was the kind of guy who wore his bias like a badge of honor. Everyone in town knew his courtroom wasn't about justice, it was about power. And when Riley and Ryan found themselves standing before him, they knew they were in for a fight. It all started with a stop sign. The twins were driving home one evening, the windows down, music playing low. They slowed at an intersection, but apparently not enough for Deputy Caleb White, a rookie cop with something to prove. He pulled them over, claiming they'd rolled through the stop. Now, if you've ever been pulled over for something minor, you know the drill: license, registration, a little back and forth, and you're on your way. But not this time. Deputy White's demeanor changed the second he saw the sisters. His tone turned sharp, almost aggressive, and before long, the situation escalated. Ryan, the feistier of the two, didn't hold back. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice firm. "Why are you treating us like criminals?" Bad move. Deputy White's face hardened, and within minutes, backup arrived. The twins were handcuffed and hauled off to the station, charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Bogus charges, of course, but in Riverton, bogus charges stick when you're black and standing in front of a judge like Jenkins. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Word had gotten around, and everyone wanted to see how this would play out. Jenkins wasted no time tearing into the twins, mocking their appearance, their upbringing, even their military service. Military, huh? He sneered. You mean to tell me they let just anyone in these days? That's when Riley stepped forward and dropped the bombshell about their army training. The room went still, Jenkins' face a mask of shock. And as everyone leaned forward, holding their breath, I couldn't help but wonder, what's a man like Jenkins going to do now that he knows these women aren't what he thought? Now, let me tell you something, folks. If you'd been in that courtroom when Riley Carter made her declaration about their U.S. Army training, you'd have seen the look on Judge Jenkins' face, a mix of disbelief, embarrassment, and maybe just a hint of fear. The man was caught off guard, and it was written all over him. But, let me tell you this story. It wasn't about to get easier for anyone involved. For a moment, Jenkins sat there frozen. The courtroom had erupted into murmurs, whispers flying from one row to the next like wildfire. Some were shocked, others curious, and a few clearly enjoying the rare sight of Jenkins being put in his place. The twins stood their ground, calm and unwavering, as though they'd been preparing for this very moment their whole lives. But Jenkins wasn't a man who liked losing control. His cheeks burned red as he slammed his gavel down, demanding silence. Order. I said order in this courtroom, he barked, his voice cracking slightly. That crack? Oh, it was subtle, but it told everyone in the room what we already knew. He was rattled. You think this is some kind of joke? Jenkins snapped, glaring at Riley and Ryan. Bringing up your military training like it's supposed to impress me? Let me remind you where you are. This is my courtroom, and I'll be the one asking the questions. Riley folded her arms, her expression calm but unyielding. We're not here to impress you, Your Honor. We're here for justice. The room went silent again. You could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, gripping the edge of his desk like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Justice, he muttered, almost to himself, before shaking his head and smirking again. You want justice? Fine. Let's talk about the charges against you. Now, let's rewind a bit, because what happened before this courtroom scene? That's where the real buildup lies. You see, after the twins were arrested, the news spread through Riverton like gossip at a church picnic. A lot of folks were outraged, especially their neighbors who knew the twins were the kind of people to stop and help you if your car broke down or mow your lawn if you couldn't do it yourself. But there were others, people like Judge Jenkins, who saw this as an opportunity to remind everyone how things work around here. The morning after their arrest, Maria Carter sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she read the charges in the newspaper. Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The words stared back at her like a slap in the face. Her daughters, her pride and joy, were being painted as troublemakers, and she knew exactly why. Maria had seen this kind of injustice before, back when she was their age. Back then, it was her father getting hauled into court for stepping out of line. Different decade, same story. The twins had spent the night in holding cells before being released on bail, and when they walked through their mom's front door, she could barely hold back her tears. What happened? She asked, her voice shaking. Riley shrugged, setting her army-issued duffel bag down by the couch. We got pulled over. The cop didn't like that we questioned him. That's putting it mildly, Ryan muttered, flopping down onto the couch. The guy was itching for a fight. Maria shook her head, her heart sinking. She'd spent her whole life trying to prepare her daughters for moments like this, but it didn't make it any easier to see them go through it. You know what this is about, she said softly. We know, Riley replied, her tone firm. And we're not backing down. Now, here's where things get interesting. The twins could have taken a deal. The prosecutor, a smug man named Randall Burke, offered them a slap on the wrist if they just plead guilty to causing a disturbance. But Riley and Ryan? They weren't having it. They refused to admit guilt for something they didn't do, especially when the charges were clearly racially motivated. Their refusal put them squarely in Jenkins' crosshairs. By the time their court date rolled around, everyone in town knew it was going to be a spectacle. Jenkins had a reputation for turning trials into performances, and he was planning to make an example out of the twins. But what he didn't know was that Riley and Ryan weren't your average defendants. Now, back to the courtroom. After Jenkins regained his composure, he leaned forward, steepling his fingers as he eyed the sisters. Let's cut to the chase, he said, his voice low and deliberate. You were pulled over for breaking the law. Instead of cooperating, you chose to argue with a law enforcement officer. That's not bravery, that's recklessness. Do you deny it? Ryan opened her mouth, but Riley raised a hand to stop her. "We don't deny questioning the officer," Riley said calmly. "But we didn't resist arrest. And we sure as hell didn't cause a disturbance. The only disturbance that day was the officer's attitude." Jenkins chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't get you out of this one." That's when Riley dropped another bombshell. "We have video footage, Your Honor," she said, pulling out a flash drive and holding it up for the courtroom to see. "Body cam footage from Deputy White's arrest. It'll show exactly what happened." The room erupted again, people murmuring and craning their necks to get a better look. Jenkins' face went pale for a split second before he banged his gavel again. "Order. This court will review the evidence in due time." But you know what? That gavel didn't do a thing to stop the shift in power that had just taken place. The twins had turned the tables, and the judge knew it. What happened next? Oh, it's a moment I'll never forget. But let's just say, Jenkins wasn't done trying to maintain control, and the next move he made? It changed everything. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Riley handed the flash drive to her attorney, a sharp but quiet man named Mark Whitfield. He had a reputation for being calm under pressure, and today, he was going to need every ounce of it. Judge Jenkins sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process what had just happened. Body cam footage? That wasn't part of his script. He liked his trials neat and predictable, especially when they involved defendants like Riley and Ryan Carter. Jenkins leaned forward, his voice dripping with faux authority. "Mr. Whitfield, I trust you'll make sure the so-called evidence is relevant before wasting this court's valuable time." Whitfield, as cool as a cucumber, stood and nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. But I think you'll find this evidence very enlightening." The judge didn't like that answer. His lips tightened, and he gave a curt nod to the bailiff to retrieve the flash drive. The courtroom fell silent again as the bailiff handed it to the clerk, who loaded the footage onto a screen at the front of the room. Jenkins cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. "Proceed," he barked. The footage began playing, and let me tell you folks, it was like a wrecking ball smashing through the judge's carefully crafted narrative. The video started with the twins' car pulling up to a stop sign. They paused for a good 3 seconds before rolling through the intersection. It was clear they'd stopped, anyone watching could see that. But then came the police cruiser, lights flashing, pulling them over. Deputy Caleb White walked up to the driver's side window, his body cam catching every word. "License and registration," he said, his tone sharp and impatient. Riley handed over her license, her voice calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You didn't come to a complete stop at the sign," White replied, even though the video clearly showed otherwise. Riley started to explain, but White cut her off. "Step out of the vehicle." Ryan, in the passenger seat, chimed in. "Step out? For what? We didn't do anything wrong." That's when White's tone shifted. It wasn't about the stop sign anymore. His words became more forceful, his demands more aggressive. "Don't argue with me," he snapped. "Step out, or I'll arrest you for obstruction." The courtroom watched as the twins calmly complied, stepping out of the car with their hands visible. The footage showed them standing by the car, asking questions but remaining composed. Then, out of nowhere, White moved to cuff Ryan, claiming she was being uncooperative. When Riley tried to intervene, verbally not physically, White pushed her against the car and cuffed her too. The video ended with the twins being loaded into the back of the cruiser, their faces stoic but their frustration evident. As the footage stopped, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. People exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Jenkins, however, looked like he'd just swallowed a lemon. He cleared his throat, his usual smug demeanor nowhere to be found. "Well," he began, his voice unusually tight, "this footage certainly paints a different picture." Ryan, who had been holding back the whole time, finally spoke up. "A different picture? That's the truth, Your Honor. The officer had no reason to arrest us. None." Jenkins scowled, but before he could respond, Mark Whitfield stood again. "Your Honor, it's clear from the footage that my clients were not resisting arrest or causing a disturbance. The charges against them are baseless." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Jenkins slammed his gavel again. "Order. I will not tolerate disruptions in my courtroom." But here's the thing, folks. The courtroom wasn't listening to Jenkins anymore. The power had shifted, and everyone knew it. The twins weren't just two young women being railroaded by the system. They were fighters, and they had the evidence to back them up. Now, you'd think that would have been the end of it, right? That the footage would have cleared everything up, and Jenkins would have had no choice but to dismiss the case. But let me tell you something about men like Judge Harlow Jenkins. They don't like losing. And this man? He was about to pull one of the dirtiest moves I've ever seen in a courtroom. "Mr. Whitfield," Jenkins said, his voice icy, "while this footage is certainly compelling, it doesn't change the fact that your clients were argumentative and disrespectful to a law enforcement officer. This court takes such behavior very seriously." Whitfield raised an eyebrow. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the footage shows no such thing. My clients were simply asking questions, which is their right." Jenkins ignored him, turning to the prosecutor, Randall Burke. "Mr. Burke, do you have any additional evidence or witnesses to support the charges?" Burke smirked, standing up with the confidence of a man who had a trick up his sleeve. "As a matter of fact, I do, Your Honor. The officer in question, Deputy Caleb White, is here to testify." The courtroom gasped. Riley and Ryan exchanged a glance, their calm composure faltering for just a moment. They hadn't expected White to show up, and they definitely hadn't expected Burke to double down on the lies. Jenkins smiled, his confidence restored. "Very well. Let's hear what Deputy White has to say." And just like that, the stage was set for the next round of this fight. The twins had played their card, but now Jenkins and Burke were playing theirs. What would happen when White took the stand? Would the truth finally prevail, or would the system find another way to crush it? Deputy Caleb White walked into the courtroom with a stiff, uneasy swagger. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, but his eyes told a different story, nervous, shifty, like a man who knew he was walking into deep waters without a lifeboat. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as he took the stand, his expression caught somewhere between defiance and dread. For a moment, he avoided looking in the direction of the twins, but Riley and Ryan stared at him with a kind of unwavering intensity that could crack stone. "State your name and occupation for the record," Burke said, his voice smooth, almost smug, as he approached the stand. "Deputy Caleb White," the officer answered, his voice steady enough, though there was a slight edge to it. "I'm a patrol officer with the Riverton Police Department." "Thank you, Deputy White," Burke said, pacing slowly in front of the stand like he was savoring the moment. "Now, let's get right to it. Can you describe, in your own words, what happened the day you pulled over the defendants?" White cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Jenkins before launching into his story. "Yes, sir. I observed the defendants rolling through a stop sign at an intersection. It was a clear violation, so I initiated a traffic stop. When I approached the vehicle, both individuals became argumentative, refusing to comply with my instructions. For my safety and theirs, I asked them to step out of the vehicle. That's when the situation escalated." "Escalated how?" Burke pressed, leaning forward slightly. "They began shouting," White continued, his tone growing more confident now that he was in his rhythm. "The passenger, in particular, was very aggressive, questioning my authority and refusing to follow instructions. I had no choice but to place them under arrest for disorderly conduct and obstruction." Now folks, if you'd been there, you'd have seen the looks on the twins' faces. They didn't shout, didn't interrupt, but their expression said it all. Ryan clenched her jaw so tightly you could almost hear her teeth grinding, while Riley folded her hands in front of her, calm but clearly calculating her next move. Their attorney, Mark Whitfield, sat still as a statue, letting Burke have his moment. But I'll tell you this, when it was Whitfield's turn to cross-examine, the entire mood shifted. Whitfield stood, adjusting his tie as he approached the stand with measured steps. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, but when he spoke, people leaned in to listen. "Deputy White," he began, his tone even, "you stated that my clients were shouting and aggressive. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," White replied, though the confidence in his voice wavered just a little. "And this shouting, this aggression, you're certain it occurred?" "Absolutely," White said, leaning forward slightly. "I remember it clearly." Whitfield paused for a moment, then gestured to the screen where the body cam footage had just been played. "Deputy, were you wearing your department-issued body camera that day?" "Yes." "And the footage we just watched, would you agree that it accurately captured the events of that traffic stop?" White hesitated, glancing at Burke, who gave him the slightest nod. "Yes, it does." Whitfield smiled faintly, a glint of steel in his eyes. "Then can you point out for the court where in that footage my clients were shouting or behaving aggressively?" The room went silent again. White's jaw tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well," he began, "the footage doesn't always capture tone or attitude. You'd have to be there to understand." Whitfield's smile didn't falter. "I see. So the footage, which is designed to provide an unbiased record of events, doesn't support your claims. Is that what you're saying?" White opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at Jenkins, who was glaring at Whitfield like he'd just insulted his mother. I'm saying that it doesn't show everything," White muttered. Whitfield pounced. "What it does show, Deputy, is my clients calmly complying with your orders while asking reasonable questions about why they were being detained. Isn't that correct?" White squirmed in his seat. "I wouldn't call it reasonable." "Yes or no, Deputy," Whitfield interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "Do the defendants appear to comply with your orders in the footage?" "Yes," White admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And yet you arrested them. Why?" "Obstruction," White muttered, but the fight was gone from his voice. "Obstruction," Whitfield repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "From two women standing calmly by their vehicle, asking questions? Forgive me, Deputy, but it seems to me the only obstruction that day was your ego." The courtroom erupted into gasps and murmurs, but Whitfield wasn't done. He turned to Jenkins, his expression serious. "Your Honor, this testimony is not only inconsistent with the video evidence, but it also reeks of bias. I move to dismiss all charges against my clients." Now, folks, if you think Jenkins was going to take that lying down, you don't know the man. He sat up straight, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Mr. Whitfield," he snapped, "this court will determine the validity of the charges, not you. Deputy White's testimony is still under review." But before Jenkins could ramble on, something happened that turned the whole case on its head. The courtroom doors burst open, and a tall man in military dress blues strode in, his uniform gleaming with medals. Heads turned, and whispers spread like wildfire. The man approached the defense table, saluted the twins, and then turned to Jenkins. "Your Honor," he said, his voice commanding, "I'm Colonel James Redding, commanding officer of Sergeant Riley Carter and Sergeant Ryan Carter. I've come to testify on their behalf." The room froze. Jenkins' face turned ghostly pale, and for the first time that day, he looked genuinely afraid. "Folks, you wouldn't believe what happened next, but trust me, this case was about to explode." The courtroom was dead silent as Colonel James Redding stood tall and unflinching at the defense table, his medals gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The man was a walking embodiment of authority, and his presence alone sent shockwaves through the room. People whispered frantically, their curiosity boiling over. But Judge Jenkins? Oh, he looked like he'd swallowed his own gavel. Whatever smugness he'd been clinging to was gone in an instant. "Colonel Redding," Jenkins finally managed to say, though his voice lacked its usual arrogance, "this is highly irregular. You can't just barge into my courtroom." The colonel didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his tone firm but respectful, "this isn't just your courtroom. It's a court of law, and I'm here to ensure the truth is heard." The crowd murmured louder now, the tension crackling like a storm about to break. Riley and Ryan exchanged a quick glance, their calm composure still intact, but even they seemed slightly caught off guard by the sudden arrival of their commanding officer. Jenkins slammed his gavel again, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Colonel, unless you have something relevant to contribute to this case, I suggest you take your seat." Redding squared his shoulders and stepped forward, unshaken. "I have everything to contribute, Your Honor. These two women served under my command for 6 years. I know their character, their discipline, and their integrity. I also know that the charges against them are baseless, and that this trial is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to undermine their reputation." The room erupted into gasps, and Jenkins' face turned an alarming shade of red. He gripped the edge of his bench like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "Colonel Redding," he hissed, "I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus." Redding didn't back down. "And I will not stand by while 2 of my soldiers are railroaded by a system that should be protecting them. If you think I came here unprepared, Your Honor, you're mistaken. I've brought their service records, commendations, and a written statement from General Howard himself, vouching for their character. Now, folks, let me pause here to paint you a picture." The weight of Colonel Redding's words hit the courtroom like a sledgehammer. Jenkins, who had spent years wielding his power unchecked, was suddenly backed into a corner. And let me tell you, he did not like it one bit. But Jenkins wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. This trial isn't about their military service, he snapped. It's about their behavior during a lawful traffic stop. Redding raised an eyebrow. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like it's about something else entirely. The courtroom gasped again, and Jenkins' jaw tightened. The man was losing control, and he knew it. Whitfield seized the moment. Your Honor, he said, standing tall beside the colonel, with the new evidence presented today, including the body cam footage and Colonel Redding's testimony, it's clear that the charges against my clients lack merit. I renew my motion to dismiss. Jenkins glared at Whitfield, his lips pressed into a thin line. He was cornered, and everyone in the room knew it. But just as it seemed like he might cave, Burke, the prosecutor, stood up, his smirk firmly in place. Your Honor, Burke said, his voice oozing with false confidence. If Colonel Redding wants to vouch for the defendants, that's fine. But it doesn't erase the fact that they were argumentative and disrespectful during a lawful stop. The prosecution stands by the charges. Whitfield shot Burke a sharp look, but before he could respond, Ryan finally spoke up. Disrespectful, she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Is it disrespectful to ask why you're being pulled over? Is it disrespectful to want answers when you're being treated like a criminal for no reason? Burke opened his mouth, but Ryan wasn't done. We served this country, she said, her voice rising. We put our lives on the line so people like you could sit here and twist the truth without consequence. And now you want to call us disrespectful? No, sir. What's disrespectful is a system that protects people like Deputy White while tearing down people like us. The room erupted into cheers and applause, a rare moment of defiance in a place that usually swallowed people whole. Jenkins slammed his gavel furiously, shouting for order, but it was clear the tide had turned. The courtroom wasn't on his side anymore. But just as it seemed like the twins might finally catch a break, Jenkins made his next move, and folks, it was as dirty as they come. Enough, he roared, his face flushed with anger. This court will not be hijacked by emotional appeals or theatrics. The motion to dismiss is denied. We'll proceed with the trial, and I'll remind everyone here that I alone determine what is admissible. Riley and Ryan exchanged a look, their calm resolve shaken but not broken. Whitfield leaned toward them, whispering something I couldn't hear, but whatever he said, it made Riley nod firmly. And then Jenkins dropped the bombshell. Furthermore, he continued, I'm placing the defendants under a gag order. They are not to speak to the press or anyone outside this courtroom about these proceedings. Any violation will result in immediate contempt of court. The crowd gasped, and Whitfield shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's highly irregular. It's my courtroom, Jenkins snapped, cutting him off. And that's my ruling. Now folks, let me tell you, I've seen a lot of things in my years covering this town, but this was a new low. The twins had fought back with everything they had, evidence, testimony, even the backing of a decorated colonel, and Jenkins was still determined to crush them. But I'll tell you this, Riley and Ryan Carter weren't done fighting. Not by a long shot. What happened next? Well, let's just say things were about to go from bad to worse. And the truth? It had a way of coming out, whether Jenkins liked it or not. The air outside the courthouse was electric. News of the twins' trial had spread beyond Riverton, and reporters had begun to gather outside in droves, cameras rolling and microphones ready. The gag order that Judge Jenkins had slapped on Riley and Ryan only added fuel to the fire. The press wanted answers. And the twins? They were caught in a game that was bigger than just their case. But if Jenkins thought a gag order would silence them, he clearly didn't know who he was dealing with. Inside the courthouse, the tension was suffocating. Colonel Redding had been forced to step down from the stand after Jenkins ruled his testimony irrelevant, a move that sent murmurs of discontent rippling through the room. Redding shot the twins a sharp, apologetic look as he returned to his seat, but Riley gave him a small nod that seemed to say, "It's not over yet." As the trial resumed, Whitfield stood to address the court, his voice steady despite the uphill battle they were clearly fighting. Your Honor, I request the opportunity to cross-examine Deputy White further. There are glaring inconsistencies in his testimony that I believe the court needs to address. Jenkins barely looked at him. Request denied. We've heard enough from Deputy White. The crowd gasped, and even Burke looked surprised by Jenkins' blatant refusal to entertain the defense's argument. But Jenkins wasn't finished. We'll proceed directly to closing arguments, he said, his tone final. This case has already gone on longer than necessary. Now, let me pause here for a second, folks. I've seen biased judges before, But Jenkins was running this trial like it was his personal grudge match. He wasn't even pretending to be impartial anymore. And trust me, it wasn't just me noticing, everyone in that room could feel it. The twins were being railroaded, plain and simple. But Whitfield wasn't about to give up. As the court prepared for closing arguments, he leaned in close to Riley and Ryan. "We're going to fight this," he whispered. "I'll use every legal avenue we have, but you need to stay calm. Don't give him any reason to escalate this further." Riley nodded, her jaw tight. "We're not backing down," she said quietly. "Not now." When Whitfield rose to deliver his closing argument, you could tell he was walking a tightrope. He had to defend the twins without pushing Jenkins too far, and that was no small feat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady and deliberate, "this case isn't just about a traffic stop. It's about fairness. It's about justice. And it's about standing up to a system that too often judges people based on the color of their skin rather than the content of their character." Jenkins visibly stiffened, but Whitfield pressed on. "You've seen the evidence. The body cam footage speaks for itself. Riley and Ryan Carter complied with every order they were given. They didn't resist, they didn't cause a disturbance, and they certainly didn't break any laws. The charges against them are not only baseless, they're insulting to their service, their integrity, and their intelligence." The jury leaned in, clearly captivated by Whitfield's words. Even the crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how far he'd go. "Your Honor," Whitfield said, turning slightly toward Jenkins, "this trial has exposed more than just the truth about what happened that day. It's exposed the biases and assumptions that too often infect our justice system. And I urge the jury to see through those biases and deliver a verdict that reflects the facts, not the prejudice." Jenkins' face was like a storm cloud as Whitfield sat down. The judge immediately turned to Burke, who rose with a smirk and began his own closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen," Burke said, his tone oozing with confidence, "this isn't about prejudice. It's about accountability. Law enforcement officers have a tough job, and they rely on our support to maintain order. The defendant's behavior that day, questioning authority, refusing to comply, undermines the very fabric of that order." Ryan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Riley reached over and squeezed her hand, silently urging her to stay calm. Burke continued, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "The body cam footage might not show raised voices or aggressive behavior, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Sometimes, tone and intent are just as important as words or actions. Deputy White acted in the interest of public safety, and the charges against the defendants reflect that." By the time Burke finished, the room was a powder keg of tension. Jenkins, clearly satisfied, instructed the jury to begin deliberations. But here's the thing, folks. Deliberations in cases like this? They don't always go the way you think they will. And when the jury left the room, the real drama began. As soon as the jury was gone, Jenkins leaned forward, his eyes locking on Riley and Ryan like a predator sizing up its prey. "I'd advise the defendants to prepare themselves for the consequences of their actions," he said, his tone icy. Whitfield shot to his feet. "Your Honor, that's completely inappropriate. Sit down, Mr. Whitfield." Jenkins barked, slamming his gavel so hard it echoed through the room. "This court will not tolerate outbursts from counsel." But before anyone could say another word, a loud commotion erupted outside the courtroom doors. Shouting, followed by the unmistakable sound of reporters yelling questions, filled the air. Jenkins scowled. "What is going on out there?" A bailiff rushed in, his face pale. "Your Honor," he stammered, "the press is demanding to speak with the defendants. And, there's someone else out there." "Who?" Jenkins snapped. The bailiff hesitated. "It's General Howard, sir. He's here in person." The courtroom exploded into murmurs. Riley and Ryan froze, their eyes widening in disbelief. Jenkins, for the first time all day, looked genuinely shaken. "General Howard," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "Yes, sir. And he says he has evidence he wants to present." And just like that, folks, the trial took a turn no one could have predicted. What evidence could a general possibly have? And how was Jenkins going to handle this curveball? The tension in the courtroom hit a boiling point as the doors swung open. General Howard walked in, commanding the kind of respect that even Jenkins couldn't ignore. The man wasn't just a decorated officer, he was a living legend. His broad shoulders, crisp uniform, and steely gaze demanded attention, and as he strode down the aisle, the murmurs in the room grew louder. Even the jury, who had been ushered into deliberations just minutes earlier, was now peeking back through the doors, curious about the sudden appearance of such a high-ranking military official. General Howard, Judge Jenkins said, struggling to maintain his composure. What, exactly, do you think you're doing? This is highly irregular. The general stopped in front of the bench, his posture as straight as a rifle. Your Honor, I understand this isn't typical protocol, he said, his voice calm but powerful. But neither is what I've seen here today. I came because my former soldiers, Riley and Ryan Carter, are being treated unjustly. And I have proof that not only clears them of these baseless charges, but exposes misconduct by Deputy White. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters were on their feet, spectators whispered furiously, and even Jenkins looked like he might fall out of his chair. He banged his gavel so hard I thought it might break. Order. I demand order in this courtroom. Howard didn't flinch. He turned to Jenkins, holding out a manila folder. This contains evidence from the Army's Internal Investigation Unit, Your Honor. It includes communications and records showing Deputy White targeted these women because of their race and their service. He knew who they were the moment he pulled them over. The courtroom gasped. Ryan's jaw dropped, and Riley's hands balled into fists at her sides. Whitfield quickly stood, his face a mix of shock and determination. Your Honor, this evidence must be reviewed. It could change the entire trajectory of this case. But Jenkins wasn't having it. His face turned beet red as he leaned forward, his voice booming. This court does not accept unsolicited evidence from unauthorized parties. General Howard, if you have something to say, you can submit it through the proper channels. Howard raised an eyebrow, unshaken by Jenkins' tantrum. With all due respect, Your Honor, these women swore an oath to protect this country, just as I did. And this court has a duty to ensure justice. If you refuse to accept this evidence, I will take it to the federal courts, and I assure you they'll be very interested to know why you refuse to hear it. Let me tell you, folks, I've seen judges lose their temper, but Jenkins? He was spiraling. His hands gripped the edge of his bench, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to try and dismiss Howard entirely. But then, something shifted in the room. The courtroom doors opened again, and this time, a new figure stepped in. It was a federal attorney, a no-nonsense woman with a briefcase in one hand and a piercing gaze that seemed to take in the entire room at once. Your Honor, she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a razor, I'm Special Prosecutor Linda Graves. I've been sent to observe this case and ensure its proceedings are in accordance with federal law. Jenkins froze. The color drained from his face, and for the first time all day, he looked like a man who realized the walls were closing in. Ms. Graves, he said, his voice shaky, this is highly unusual. So is a gag order in a case involving potential racial bias and misconduct. Graves interrupted, her tone icy. I've reviewed the preliminary reports, and it seems clear this trial has been mishandled from the start. Effective immediately, I'm requesting the case be put on hold pending federal review. The room erupted into chaos once again. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, spectators murmured in disbelief, and Jenkins sat there, staring at Graves like she'd just set his bench on fire. Meanwhile, Riley and Ryan sat frozen in their seats. For weeks, they'd been fighting tooth and nail to prove their innocence, and now for the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. Riley leaned over to Whitfield. What does this mean? She whispered. It means Jenkins can't keep stonewalling us anymore, Whitfield whispered back, his voice tinged with cautious optimism. If this goes to federal review, they'll have to look at everything. White's actions, the body cam footage, even Jenkins' rulings. Ryan looked over at General Howard, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. He really came through for us, she muttered. More than that, Riley replied. He just blew this whole thing wide open. Back at the bench, Jenkins was visibly sweating now. This is my courtroom, he growled, his voice faltering. And I will not allow it to be hijacked by outside interference. Graves didn't even blink. Your courtroom operates under the law, Judge Jenkins, she said sharply. And if you have nothing to hide, then you should welcome federal oversight. The tension in the room was suffocating. For a long moment, Jenkins didn't say anything. Then finally, he slammed his gavel down one last time. This court is adjourned until further notice, he spat. Bailiff, clear the room. As people filed out of the courtroom, the twins stayed seated, still processing everything that had just happened. General Howard approached them, his expression serious but warm. "This isn't over yet," he said. "But you've got the truth on your side. Don't forget that." Riley nodded, her voice steady. "We won't." The courtroom may have been adjourned, but the battle was far from over. As the federal investigation began, the tension in Riverton only grew. It wasn't just about Riley and Ryan anymore. It was about the cracks in the system that people had ignored for too long. For weeks, the town buzzed with rumors, speculation, and a growing unease. But when the federal team finally delivered their findings, it wasn't just a revelation, it was a reckoning. The first blow came during a press conference held by Special Prosecutor Linda Graves. Standing at a podium surrounded by microphones and flashing cameras, Graves addressed the public with the kind of directness that made people sit up and listen. "Our investigation has uncovered clear evidence of racial bias and abuse of power by both Deputy Caleb White and Judge Harlow Jenkins," she began, her voice cutting through the hum of reporters. "This includes falsified reports, improper conduct during traffic stops, and discriminatory rulings in the courtroom." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Graves continued, unflinching. "Deputy White specifically targeted Riley and Ryan Carter because of their military service, as evidenced by text messages and internal communications obtained through subpoenas. These messages reveal a disturbing pattern of prejudice, with White referring to the Carters as uppity and claiming he would put them in their place." The crowd erupted into a frenzy of questions, but Graves wasn't done. "Furthermore, Judge Jenkins has been found to have a history of issuing harsher sentences to defendants of color, often dismissing evidence that would exonerate them. His rulings have violated the basic principles of justice, and as of this morning, he has been removed from the bench pending criminal charges." Back in Riverton, the news spread like wildfire. The once untouchable Judge Jenkins had been toppled, and Deputy White? He was suspended from the force and facing charges for falsifying reports and misconduct. For the first time in years, it felt like the system had been forced to answer for its wrongs. But for Riley and Ryan, the fight wasn't just about punishment, it was about clearing their names. The Federal Review officially dismissed all charges against them, and their military records, which had been brought into question by Jenkins' courtroom antics, were fully restored. The twins were exonerated, and their dignity was intact. The day the charges were dropped, the Carters stood on the steps of the courthouse, facing a crowd of reporters and supporters. Riley stepped forward first, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just a victory for us," she said. "It's a victory for everyone who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or judged unfairly. We didn't just fight for ourselves, we fought for our community, for our mother, and for the people who couldn't stand here today." Ryan stepped up next, her usual fiery demeanor tempered by a quiet strength. "We're proud of who we are. We're proud of our service, of our family, and of where we come from. And we won't stop fighting until this kind of injustice stops, for everyone." The crowd erupted into cheers, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the past few months had been lifted. But as the twins embraced their mother, Maria, who stood with tears streaming down her face, they knew the fight wasn't over. They had won their battle, but the war for justice was far from finished. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the case continued. Jenkins faced criminal charges for judicial misconduct, and the Riverton Police Department was placed under federal oversight. Deputy White resigned from the force in disgrace, and his actions became a cautionary tale for law enforcement nationwide. But perhaps the biggest change came in the form of a community awakening. People began to speak out against the injustices they had long ignored, demanding accountability and reform. As for Riley and Ryan, they didn't just move on, they moved forward. They began working with local advocacy groups, using their platform to shine a light on systemic racism and empower others to stand up for their rights. Their story became a symbol of resilience and courage, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the truth could prevail. Now, folks, I've covered a lot of stories in my day, but this one will stick with me forever. It's a story about courage, about standing up to a system that tried to tear two strong women down, and failing. It's about a community waking up, about people realizing that justice isn't just handed out in courtrooms, it's something you have to fight for, tooth and nail. And Riley and Ryan? They're not just heroes, they're trailblazers. Their fight didn't just change their lives, it changed Riverton. And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire a few more towns to take a hard look at themselves and do the same. So here's my advice, folks. Don't stay quiet. Don't back down. And don't ever let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. Because as Riley and Ryan Carter proved, sometimes the smallest voices can bring the biggest changes. That's all for now. But if you hear of another story that needs telling, you know where to find me. Until then, stay safe, stay strong, and never stop fighting for what's right.